Okay, hello everyone and welcome to OWASP London online chapter meeting. Today we have two talks from Olivia Liddell and Katie Paxton-Fear. This is OWASP London, and agenda for tonight is after the first introduction, news and updates. Hello everyone and we're going to have OWASP London online chapter meeting. We're going to have today we have two talks from Olivia Liddell and Katie Paxton-Fear. This is OWASP London, and agenda for tonight is after the first introduction, news and updates. Hello everyone and we're going to have OWASP London online chapter meeting. We're going to have today we have two talks from Olivia Liddell and Katie Paxton-Fear. Yeah, apologies. Looks like we had some problems with the echo. I'm just going to try to stop that echo. My name is Sam Stepanyan. I'm the OWASP chapter leader. My OWASP chapter co-leaders are Andra Letza and Sharif Mansour. You can find our Twitter handles on the screen right now. Our Twitter handle for OWASP London chapter is at OWASP London, and the hashtag for the event, if you're going to tweet about it, is #OWASP London. So usually at this point, I have a few slides about OWASP and benefits of membership in it. But tonight I have a video which I'm going to try to play and see if it's going to work. Okay, I'm going to play it right now.
OWASP is a nonprofit that stands for the Open Web Application Security Project. OWASP is a community of developers, technologists, and evangelists improving the security of software through tools and resources. OWASP has 100+ active projects, and new project applications are submitted weekly. Projects are open source and are built by our community of volunteers, people just like you. Community and networking. There are hundreds of local chapters worldwide and thousands of members. Meetings are free and open to everyone. They include training, talks, and networking opportunities. Education and training. OWASP hosts many events each year. They are a great way to improve your skills, build your professional network, and learn about new trends in the industry. One of the many ways you can get involved is to become a member. The membership benefits include discounts for events and trainings, your own OWASP email address and Google Workspace access, a vote in our OWASP Global Board elections. And recently, OWASP added a brand new member benefit, access to hands-on application security training through the OWASP Secure Flag Open Platform. Join us and become a member today.
Okay, I hope that video worked. As mentioned in the video, OWASP is a worldwide free and open community focused on improving security of application software. Everyone's free to participate, and all of our materials are available under a free and open software license. And we are a global non-profit charitable organization. We're a vendor-neutral community, and some people refer to us as a collective wisdom of the best minds in application security worldwide. We provide free tools, guidance, and documentation to everyone. We're all volunteers, and there are over 45,000 OWASP volunteers worldwide. Some of the membership benefits were already mentioned in the video. If you become a member, you will get an OWASP.org email address, and worth mentioning that you'll also get an unlimited G Suite account with it. And of course, the new benefit is the free secure flag training platform. And one of the most important benefits, of course, is that you get to vote on issues that shape direction of OWASP community. Another benefit not mentioned in the video is if you become a member, you will get this cool OWASP member sticker for your laptop. Membership is only $50 per year. Of course, for us in the UK, based on the current exchange rate, and the students is $20 per year. there are also membership packages available for our corporate members or supporters. And we currently have an offer. If you get a 2-year membership, you get 20% off to celebrate 20 years of OWASP. I believe this is currently $75 for 2 years. OWASP is a vendor-neutral community, but we are supported by many cybersecurity members, and thank you all for supporting our global community. You can see the logos of our corporate members on your screen right now. Here at London, we also have local chapter supporters. So these are all the organizations which are kindly supporting OWASP London. And if you'd like to become our supporter and have your logo displayed at the beginning and end of all our events, please get in touch with us. Okay, now I'm going to talk about upcoming events and conferences. And the biggest news for today is that next week on Tuesday, we have ZapCon, a conference on everything OWASP Zap, celebrating 10 years in the making. It is a free conference, which will be live streamed on Zoom. You can go and register right now. It's https://zapcon.io. We have more upcoming global events very soon as well. First of all, we have OWASP virtual training courses. We have them on March 9th, May 25th, June 15th, July 13th, September 7th, and November 3rd. So there are a lot of training courses running throughout the day. You can find out the agenda by going to owasp.org. Of course, first one's kicking off again on Tuesday as well. So OWASP virtual training courses are not free, but they actually quite competitively priced compared with other commercial cybersecurity training vendors. So if you would like to train your company's developers or security engineers, I urge you to check out OWASP virtual training because it's quite an affordable way to get your staff trained on various cybersecurity topics, including threat modeling and mobile application security this time. We're also going to have a series of lightning conferences. I'm going to speak about one of them very soon. And we also going to have something called Brain Break, which is a virtual entertainment event. We all, of course, have the Zoom fatigue. Everyone is on Zoom from at least 9 a.m. till 6 p.m. every single day. And we keep talking about work, work, work. And OWASP has decided that let's put an end to this. Let's actually switch our brains and think about something different. So we're going to run a series of virtual entertainment, which will include things like comedy shows and online concerts. The first Brain Break event has actually already happened on February 18th. We had a great comedian, Jeff Shaw, which presented his stand-up show over the Zoom session, which was really great and great fun and entertainment. If you are a vendor or in cybersecurity space and you would like to sponsor these Brain Break events as well, please get in touch with us because we are planning to run quite a few of them. And this is an opportunity for you as well to get your logo and your advertisement presented during the virtual entertainment event. So watch out for the announcement for the next one. It's going to be on April 20th. Now about lightning conferences. We have a lightning conference coming up on March 15th. It's absolutely free for you to register. And we're going to have a famous bug bounty hunter, Frederick Stock, talking about how to turn your cybersecurity hobby into a career in bug bounties. Of course, Frederick Stock is one of the most popular bug bounty hunters. His channel on YouTube attracts tens of thousands of fans and views of subscribers, and he's one of the top bug bounty hunters on HackerOne platform. And actually, we have Katie Paxton-Fear today with us presenting a talk, and I believe she was actually interviewed by Stock at I think one of the earlier HackerOne events a couple of years ago. And another very big event we have coming up this year is the 20th anniversary celebration conference. This year marks 20 years of OWASP. Yes, OWASP was started in September 2001. So 20 years old. Here we are with the same vulnerabilities, more or less. But of course, we are looking forward to securing the next 20 years, and we're going to celebrate with a 24-hour event on Friday, September 24th. Currently, we have the CFP open for this event. It's going to be a virtual online event. Please do submit talks for it. Another update is from our chapter co-leader, Sharif Mansour, who is also an OWASP Global Board member, who has also been voted an OWASP Global Board chair for this year. What he started doing this video updates quite regularly about what is happening with OWASP and plans that OWASP board has for the nearest future. And you can watch them all on YouTube on our OWASP London and the main OWASP Global channel as well. One of the I think Sharif's actually recorded an update about 20 minutes ago, so it would be good for you to catch up with it after this event. I believe Sharif will be able to join us later on, and maybe he'll be able to speak about updates as well. One interesting thing to update you, which actually comes from Sharif, is that last year, despite the pandemic, the membership in OWASP actually grew. So we have more members joining OWASP, which is, of course, excellent news. And those of you who are wondering why Sharif has this wonderful, glorious weather, blue skies, and palm trees behind him, at the moment, he's not in London, he's in Egypt, working from Egypt, from his family home there. And that is why his videos have this glorious background, even though in London, we currently not having a very good weather. So yeah, that's the updates on the OWASP board. And another update on OWASP projects. We have now 205 OWASP projects registered in our project inventory. That includes 20 flagship projects. Please make sure that you familiarize yourself with them. And another great initiative, which was started by another OWASP Global Board member and OWASP Bangalore chapter leader, Vandana Verma. She has started recording a series of videos called OWASP Spotlight. So if you go and Google for OWASP Spotlight project, you will be able to find these videos on YouTube. They are approximately 10 minutes long, giving you a 10-minute introduction into an OWASP project. And that's a short, focused intro, usually from the project leader, and gives you this bite-sized focused information on OWASP project. I think this is a great initiative, so please do check it out. Another interesting update, if you're interested in OWASP projects, in January 2020, there was a mini summit session of Open Security Summit, and we ran a session called How OWASP Can Help Security Teams, and these are various guides and testing tools for DevSecOps. And one of the training sessions there was on mapping OWASP projects to the famous DevSecOps loop. And on the slide, you can see, for example, where OWASP ZAP is. You can, again, just Google for Open Security Summit and find the January 2021 mini summit session, where you can actually download that presentation, which has that mapping project in a Google slide presentation. Okay, now let's move on to our main talks, just to update everyone that how you can ask questions live today. You have two options. If you're watching us on YouTube and you have a YouTube account, you can just type your question in the chat on the right-hand side of your screen. Alternatively, if you don't have a YouTube or Google account, or you want to ask a question anonymously, you can also use a Slido website. So you just go to slide.do/OWASP and you can ask your question there. We will relay your question to the speakers. Now let me introduce you to the first speaker, Olivia Liddell. Olivia is a technical curriculum developer at Amazon Web Services, AWS, where she creates training courses for AWS Cloud. And I believe many of us have tried teaching OWASP top 10 to developers, myself included, but are we actually doing this properly? Probably not. And why? Because we are not professional teachers. And Olivia is actually a professional teacher. She previously worked even as a middle school teacher in Chicago public schools. She comes from Chicago and joins us from Chicago, and we are very happy that we can use a virtual facility and use Zoom to connect with her in United States. After after her career as a middle school teacher, Olivia moved on to become an educational technology consultant to support various colleges and universities. She's a frequent speaker. I saw her present at many conferences, including one in Scotland a few years ago. And she usually speaks on various topics, which include mentoring, team building, and social engineering. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Olivia, I'm going to ask you to start sharing yours.
Excellent. Thank you
Welcome,
so much. It's great to be here with you all. Okay, let me move some things around here a little bit. I'm getting a full screen. Can you see my screen okay?
1 second. Yes, your screen can be seen. Thanks very much, Olivia.
Okay, wonderful.
You can start.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And thank you all who are tuning in from London, all over the world, wherever you are. It's great to be here with you today virtually to talk about how to teach the OWASP Top 10 to beginning developers. As Sam mentioned, I'm Olivia Liddell, a technical curriculum developer at AWS. And what I'm presenting here is actually a personal side project that I started thinking about and developing last summer as sort of a quarantine project. So in between doing a lot of knitting and cross-stitching and baking bread, I also thought, well, what if there's a way that I can try to help out some of the developers in our community who want to learn about security but aren't quite sure where to get started? And so I'm going to start here because first, I always love security stock photos and how ridiculous they can be. And I came across this one and thought I absolutely need to put this in my presentation because I know for many beginning developers, the idea of learning about security or specifically application security can look like this. To give you some context, as Sam mentioned, I speak frequently at tech conferences, and usually what I've seen throughout these events is that people will come up to me afterwards and say, Olivia, thanks so much for your talk. And that's so cool that you're into security. I wish that I could be into security too. And I usually will say to them, well, why not? And just in a very honest, candid way. And what comes out of that in these discussions I've had with beginning developers is that many of them will express to me the idea that they don't believe that they are a security person, that sure, they love learning about how to write code, but the idea of security feels like something that is very walled off, something that's very difficult for them to begin to grasp. And so as I started to think about this some more myself, I had this idea of what if we could intervene even earlier in the process of someone's learning journey as they're learning about writing code. Now, when I say beginning developers, to give you an idea of exactly what I'm focusing in on here, I was thinking even for developers who are just a few weeks or few months into learning code. So perhaps you have someone who knows how to write HTML. Then they got fancy with some CSS and their web pages can look very fancy. But then they learn a little bit of JavaScript too. But, so they're in the very early stages. What often happens is that this idea of security is not introduced until much later in the process for them. So with this, I like to think of it as a way of introducing secure coding as a fundamental best practice early on, even if someone does not yet know what, for example, a SQL injection is. And what I'll be presenting today is a companion workbook for beginning developers. The idea is not that this workbook that I'll show you can be a totally exhaustive resource, a single place to go for learning about the OWASP Top 10, but rather I think of it as being specifically a companion workbook, as someone is using whichever other videos, tutorials, written documentation to learn about the OWASP Top 10. This workbook can be like their buddy on the side who's giving them questions and giving them an opportunity to pause and reflect and think before they move forward. And so I also wanted to show you this graphic here to give you a sense of where this project fits into the much larger picture of learning about the OWASP Top 10. I'm sure for many of you who are watching, you've come to learn about the top 10 through any number of different methods. Perhaps you went to a meetup that was about teaching the top 10 in an hour. Perhaps you decided to go to the top 10 documentation on your own and read over the course of a few days and so forth. If you look in this gray box on the left that encompasses all the possible teaching approaches, learning tools, target audiences, and so forth, that little purple bubble that's in there is where this workbook fits in. So it's not to say that it's going to be for every single learning need that's out there, but specifically what I'm hoping to do is have this available as a tool for people who could benefit from a learning approach that takes things a little bit more slowly and makes the top 10 a lot more accessible for them. So here's where I started. And this is where I'm getting into some teaching methodology. As Sam mentioned in my introduction, I'm a former teacher. I taught, so I'll say this in the American levels first and then try to convert it over to the English equivalent. I taught students who were in the 3rd grade and also the 5th through 8th grade, which I think the latter ones are like year 7, 8, and 9 in the UK, possibly. Students who are adolescents, like 11 to 14 years old. And that was before I transitioned into a career of doing adult education. A lot of the parallels are similar though, and regardless of the age of the students that I've been teaching or training, it all starts with working backwards. Because I will admit, whenever I get really excited about starting a new project, I get so focused on the idea of how it's going to look in the end. And I think of all the flashy things I'm going to put in there and how it's just going to be this most amazing thing ever. But then I have to tell myself, okay, Olivia, slow down and actually work backwards, because before I start building something, I need to think about these 2 questions first. First, who exactly do I want to help? And the reason I ask this question first is that when you think about the community of developers who are learning about security, that can include anyone from complete beginners to those who've been working with security for 10, 15, 20 years. So in order to create the training materials that are going to be the most effective and most targeted, I, as a content creator, needed to ensure that I knew exactly who I wanted to help with this. And for any of you who are watching this, and your purpose for being here today is that you are curious about creating materials of your own to help others, I would encourage you to do the exact same thing. And know it is absolutely okay, preferable even, to figure out a very small subset of your audience that you want to help so that you can target to that specific group's needs instead of trying to create one single product that is going to address everybody's needs, because that can get a little difficult to handle. And next, I asked myself, what should learners be able to do as a result of completing this workbook? And I say, what should they be able to do? Because that is where in the course of teaching and training, it's very easy to have this slippery slope of becoming vague and thinking, well, I want people to learn about the top 10. Okay, that's a good starting point, but I knew I needed to take it further. And in order to do this, I decided to use this framework that's called Bloom's taxonomy. And when I first started learning through my teacher training program many years ago, I didn't like this. I wanted to go straight in and just start teaching people and give them knowledge. But I soon realized that in order to be the most effective at this, I needed to first think about what am I expecting my learners to be able to do. And at the very bottom of this pyramid that you have here, that's the most basic level of remembering. So for example, You might design a training course or lesson so that the learners can simply remember something, recall it. You tell them some information, they tell it back to you, and you move on. But then as you get into what we would call higher levels of thinking, that goes into not just remembering a concept, but being able to explain what that is, being able to describe it, or even go higher to do things such as comparing and contrasting, all the way up to creating, so developing, investigating. As you look at this and break it down, it becomes very clear over time that there's a distinction between the upper and lower levels of that. And in the case of the top 10, it's the difference between saying that you want a learner to be able to know what a SQL injection is versus being able to write secure code that's relevant to that particular risk and so forth. So knowing that I needed to figure out what I wanted my outcomes to be, that's when I got here. I decided I want to help beginning developers. And this is truly something I'm just passionate about. I mean, I think about the work that I do every day at AWS. The courses that I specifically develop are targeted to our beginning customers and partners, people who have no idea what the AWS cloud is, and they're coming to this from having a complete blank slate and wanting to learn. For me, that is my happy place because I think there's a certain amount of empathy that goes into helping beginning learners that you want to make sure that beginners feel comfortable, confident, and also competent. So I knew that whatever I created was going to target that audience. Next, I pulled out very specific objectives to help guide me here. So I wanted learners to be able to identify the risks that are included in the OWASP top 10. So thinking about developers who don't know what the top 10 list includes, it's a simple objective, identify what they are. Next, go into describing what they are. So you see there's a difference between identifying what the risks are and then actually describing them in your own words. The next level up is being able to compare and contrast them. And I'll explain a little bit more about why that matters later on. And then the last part is to relate the top 10 risks and prevention strategies to real life scenarios. That last bullet point was really important for me because one of the key factors that tends to distinguish adult learning theory from teaching and training younger students is that typically adults need to be able to understand exactly how what they are learning can be applied to the work that they need to do. So it's usually not just enough to be able to say, here's some information about this, here's some information about that. Rather, it actually ties back into comparing and contrasting because first, you need to help them be able to draw connections between the different parts of what they're learning, and then also connect that to how they will need to use it to do some hands-on work. Notice that with this, I'm not going to the level of teaching developers how to write secure code because that for me fell outside the scope of what I wanted to accomplish. But all of this is to say, I want to be able to help beginning developers get a solid foundation with the OWASP top 10 and feel that this is something that they can even just talk about. And they might not know yet how to write the secure code, but they're aware of what's in the top 10 list and they're able to talk about it in their own words. Now, here is where I moved on once I had my objective set. I sat down with the top 10, looked at the list, and at first I thought, okay, I'm making this workbook about the top 10. Number 1, injection, fun. Now that for me, I could look at injection and talk about that and describe it in a number of different ways. But something that occurred to me was that if I were to sit down with a beginning developer, remember someone who's just coming into HTML, CSS, maybe a little bit of another language beyond that, how likely is it that they can understand injection is the first item on this list? Because if you say to someone, oh yeah, there's this thing called a SQL injection, then you have to explain what SQL is. So in my experience as a trainer and teacher, what I try not to do is avoid situations where I'm explaining a concept to someone, and then right away I say to them, oh, by the way, before you can understand this first thing, you also have to understand this other thing that's part of that too. I know for myself, when I'm in learning contexts like that, it becomes very easy for me to shut down and feel that, oh goodness, I don't understand SQL, so what chance do I have of understanding what you're saying is a SQL injection? So for this workbook, I decided to take the approach of reordering the top 10. Now, I include a note and detail about why this list is in this order, but I felt that it was important to put it in a way that beginners could more easily grasp. Now, what you see on the right here is the order that I settled on for the companion workbook. And the green and red numbers in parentheses are just there to show you where an item shifted from its position on the left. So for example, in the official OWASP order, using components with known vulnerabilities is item number 9. In the companion workbook, it moved up 8 spots and it's number 1. Again, I'm not trying to change the order officially, but think about it like this. If you were to try to explain to someone these different risks, which ones are going to be more easy for them to understand? And in the workbook, I took the approach of explaining these not just in the sense of secure coding practices, but even encouraging learners to think about it in just more general terms. So things like saying, hey, you're using a program that's known to have some issues with it. Don't do that. Why would you do that? And so forth. And I think as a best practice, the more that you can try to connect concepts to other experiences that learners might have had outside of security, that helps to get more buy-in. I mean, I can tell you so many times in my experience training customers in my previous jobs on security, as soon as you say security, it's like you can see the fear in people's eyes. They'll say, oh no, I can't do security. But yet, if I explain it in the sense of, suppose you're sharing some photos with somebody and you put in a photo album, don't you want to put permissions on that album and make sure that only your best friends see them and not some random people on the internet? And they'll say, yeah, of course. And I'll say, guess what? That's security. You're doing these things all along. And in other words, making sure that people feel comfortable with this. And looking at the list, you'll see that it starts to build into the more difficult concepts, I would say, as the list goes on. But I wanted this to be something that learners could approach and start to feel the sense of confidence building as they are going along. Okay. So let me go back one slide here. So one thing that I wanted to focus on is what I consider to be the language of security. And to give you some insight into my background, when I was in college, I studied anthropology and specifically linguistic anthropology. So thinking about how different cultures and societies use language, the idea of language acquisition, the role that language can play within societies and cultures. And then when I was teaching, the subject that I taught was actually Arabic. So for any of you who speak Arabic, assalamu alaikum, that means hi, basically. So even though I'm no longer a language teacher, this idea of language and linguistics still permeates throughout everything that I do, especially in teaching. And I came across this quote from a German linguist named William von Humboldt, who lived in the 1800s. And he wrote, "We cannot really teach language. We can only create conditions in which it will develop spontaneously in the mind in its own way." So I thought about this. And as I was creating the workbook, which I'll show you momentarily coming up in a few slides, I wanted to give learners an opportunity to not just read a list of security risks, but also to take it further and be able to feel that they could truly own and use that language of security. Because let's be honest right now, and I'll be the first one to raise my hand for this. How many of you have ever gone through some kind of training course, whether on security or something else? You go through all the modules, you watch all the videos, and then you give yourself a pat on the back because you feel that you've learned something. But then how likely is it that you can turn it around and talk about what you've learned in your own words. Sometimes, yes, but I know often it's the case where you breeze through the training, but you haven't yet been given the opportunity to really to sit with it and learn how to talk about it in your own words. So that was one thing that was very important for me, especially because I want beginning developers to not only learn these concepts, but if they're going to be using this to get a job as a developer, I want them to have that practice of being able to talk about this confidently. So you'll see that come up. And the second focus area that I centered around was the concepts of reflection and metacognition. Now, when you're learning a new concept, it's so important to periodically pause and ask yourself these two things. With reflection, what do I know? And when that shifts into metacognition, it becomes the question of, well, how do I know that I know this? In other words, what you're doing when you introduce ongoing reflection and metacognition is that you're slowing down the learning process a little bit and intentionally injecting, so to speak, options or opportunities for you to pause and think and really look back on not just how far you've come, but how you know that you understand something or that you don't. And I'll give you an example of this for myself that's a little bit embarrassing to admit, but you know what? I'm just going to put it out there. When I personally was first learning about AWS services and starting to prepare for a certification exam, one of the things that I personally like to do a lot is start with just taking inventory of where I currently am. And for any particular concept, I will write down everything that I currently know about that topic, or I'll record myself talking on video. Same thing, just depends on what I want to do. And I came across AWS Systems Manager, and I remember I had written a note that said, I guess you use that to manage systems. Same with CloudFormation. I said, you use this to form some cloud resources. I mean, it's kind of, like I said, embarrassing to look back, but I'm so glad that I did that as my starting point, because over time I was able to continue to reflect again and write a lot more details about what I had learned. And, you know, sometimes it's so easy to get into a concept and assume that because you know something now, you've always known it all along. But with this workbook, I want to give learners that opportunity to have that proof that, yes, there once was a time when you did not know anything about cross-site scripting, but now you know a little bit more. So these are definitely two essential building blocks that can help to establish this solid foundation for beginners. And so I'm going to show you a sample section from the workbook and then actually switch over to the workbook itself. Actually, I'm going to switch over to that right now. So, oh, hello, people who are in the workbook. That always throws me off, because when I opened this earlier, there was no one up here, and I'm like, who's creeping in my Google Doc? But let me scroll through this here. So,
yes, I shared the link on YouTube, Olivia.
Thank you. Yeah, I appreciate it. It always just kind of takes me off guard, because I'm talking about security, and then I'm like, oh, yes, this is being shared, so that's okay. So this is the workbook here. And something else I'll say that for myself as a curriculum developer, it's so easy for me to go into this rabbit hole of spending way too much time thinking about which platform I want to use to host a training resource, but not actually develop the training resource. And I decided I'm going to keep this simple. I don't want people to have to feel like they need to sign up for something extra or have yet another site to use. I just want this information in the hands of people who can use it and start benefiting from it right away. So I started with a simple Google Doc, and you'll see as you go throughout, it gives you the directions for how to copy, save this, put this into your own Google Drive and so forth. And so I want to start here with this pre-assessment. This is the part I mentioned that I know can be a little bit challenging for learners, because if you don't yet know anything about these, it can feel a little bit strange to say, I don't know anything. But for those of you who are watching this and you are my target audience for this, please, 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 I promise you, dig deep into your mind and write anything at all that you can think of about this, because I guarantee if you do that, then you're able to really be able to reflect back on how far you've come. I see that there are rather a couple of questions here. Question, we need to teach the OWASP top 10 to experienced developers too. Absolutely agree. What advice can you give to experienced developers? You know, I'm so glad this question came up, because the advice I would give for more experienced developers, start here with the workbook as well. It may be a good opportunity to kind of gauge your knowledge and see just how much you already know, and really hone in on that kind of reflection and metacognition that I mentioned, to fine tune some parts that you're like, oh yeah, I thought I knew a little bit more about this, but it turns out this is more of a growth opportunity for me. Another thing that I would encourage you to do with this workbook is, especially if you're an experienced developer who happens to be mentoring someone who's a junior, use this as a way to, or as a resource in your shared mentoring sessions, so that as you can teach someone else about security, you're not having to come up with the questions of how to guide them. You can almost like work on this workbook together. And I think that there's it, I could talk about mentoring all day, but I think that for someone who's more experienced, definitely use mentoring as a way to not only help someone else, but also reinforce what you yourself already know. And there was another question, do you include sample code in your workbook? Yes, there's just a couple of them, like further down, like the XCE contains some sample code there. But that was definitely something that I kind of struggled with a bit, or wrestled with back and forth, because let me actually jump to that section here. I wanted to make sure, so like this, for example, that I wasn't throwing learners too far into the woods, so that they're going through this workbook, everything's great, they're starting to build this positive energy and feeling confident, and then they get to this and they're like, oh goodness, no, I abandon all hope. This is, I can't do this anymore. So I think in the future iterations of this, like especially as I get to the next stages of what I want to do to create like a hands-on conference workshop that takes this to the next stage, that would definitely include some more sample code. But one of the things that I put on here was this right here, which is, which parts of the code example were you able to understand? Which parts were unclear? And that's where I think it's up to the learner to be very honest with themselves and say, well, I understood like this LOL 1, 2, 3, 4 up to 9, because that looks like it's enumerating 9 different things, but I really didn't understand this other part down here and so forth. So putting code in there, but in a way that gives learners a chance to pause and reflect, and not just feel like they're being thrown in. Question about, yeah, so there is a, are you aware of the OWASP Education and Training Committee? And yeah, so actually I presented about this in January, and as a result of, on the OWASP Dev Slop show, I was invited to participate with the OWASP Education Committee, and met with them last week. And yeah, it's been wonderful to connect with some like-minded individuals, and see what other types of education initiatives are out there. Just knowing that with OWASP and the community, I just want to say that as I was developing this and telling friends about this, they would ask me like, oh, how much are you charging for this? Like, where are you going to sell it? And I said, what? That's no, that's never my intention. I feel that all of us in this community have so many gifts and talents to offer. And sometimes I myself, as a former teacher, have felt like someone who's out of place in the room because I come from a different background. But then I realize over time that actually is an asset. And I'm so happy to be able to create things like this that are a little bit different, that can help people who are really looking for this kind of education and knowledge. Yeah. So let me just go to go up a little bit to the first section here. So if I wanted to go to something like using components with known vulnerabilities, the way that you would use this workbook is that you read through a sample, the simple introduction here, and then you have some reflection questions. You also have examples of ABC company. As I was creating these scenarios, I was thinking, oh goodness, I would not want to work at ABC company because they do not have, they have a lot going on and not in a good way here. So for instance, the developers are getting close to the deadline. They need to finish the application soon. They want to use a component, but it has known vulnerabilities. So how would you advise the developers to proceed and why? I think here it's so crucial to give learners opportunities to pause and think about what would they do in that situation, because the difference here is that we're going beyond just here's a security issue and move on to the next one, but really taking the time to extend that to some true application. And just really quickly here, each section includes some sample items for prevention and links to learn more. As I mentioned, this is not intended to be the only resource that learners will ever use to learn about the OWASP Top 10, but I want them to be able to build their knowledge over time and have these opportunities to pause, reflect, and be able to compare things like what's the difference between security misconfiguration and broken access control. You know, they both sound like some kind of security issue for complete beginners. So how do you break down what those differences are? And I have just a couple more slides as we before we get into additional Q&A. So I launched this as a small pilot test amongst a group of trusted friends who span the range from experienced developers, some beginners, some of my friends who don't really know much about coding at all, and I wanted to get their take on this as well. One of my friends who's a former CTO, and he had some really great insights from his perspective. What I heard as feedback from this was that it was very well designed for the target audience. That's key to me because, like I said, with what I do every day at work, creating courses for beginners is a lot more difficult than you would think, because in other words, you need to have the knowledge that's this big, but be able to distill it down at a level that's more for this and not overwhelm people with more than what they need. They also shared that the reflection exercises were really helpful for sparking insights. We also talked about how to determine the right amount of content for each risk. It can be a slippery slope, right? Because you don't want it to be the case that you're telling someone every single thing that's out there. You want to keep it short, but give them enough to encourage them to learn more. We also, with the fourth bullet point, my friend Carl, who was a former CTO that I mentioned, he said a key point to include is this idea of real world trade-offs that often need to be made to balance security with the company's other priorities. I was so glad that he mentioned it, because that is something that beginning and experienced developers need to consider, that it's all well and good to talk about these ideas in this idealized bubble, but sometimes you have to think about how might this play out if a company has these other priorities that they're balancing. And then some people said to consider including multiple choice review questions for each risk. And I thought about that. And it's difficult because I know when I'm creating a training course that's specifically for a certification exam, that's, you're definitely going to have the multiple choice questions, because that's what the students are going to have to be expected to do. In this case, I intentionally chose not to include multiple choice questions at this point, because I didn't want a student to go through this workbook, answer a few questions right, and have this false sense of mastery that they know how to do something with that. I think multiple choice questions can be helpful to supplement it, and I think in future iterations I will. But in this case, this is me being a little bit rigorous and wanting to give students a challenge. So In closing, I'm very excited to see how more developers will respond to the workbook. I've got to say, in the first days and weeks after I launched this, I was crying a bit, good tears, because I was getting emails from people all over the world who were saying, thank you so much for, I'm about to cry now. Thank you so much for creating this because I've wanted to learn about security. It's been on my list to do, but I haven't been able to find something that actually makes me feel like I can do it. And I just think there's so much power in that, in helping people to feel that they are able to even take some first steps. And so the next plan is to incorporate this into a conference workshop that will go further to include some hands-on coding exercises, group discussions. Part of this design was that I myself am an introvert, very much so. And I know the feeling of being in training sessions where you're kind of rushed through and you don't have the time to think and reflect on your own before being expected to share out with a larger group. So that is definitely something I want to make sure carries over with that. Accommodating different learning styles as much as I can and making it so that approaching these concepts can be exciting and fun and not something that's scary. And so with that being said, my website is olivialiddell.com. If you're curious to see some of my other talks that I have created, including some on social engineering, team building, mentoring, please do check those out. And I'll stop sharing the screen now. Thank you all so much.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Olivia, for a great talk. Let me check for some questions coming up on YouTube chat. And I think some of them are coming on slide.do/OWASP. I can see one. Which was the easiest vulnerability to describe in the workbook? And which was the hardest?
Ooh, that's a good question. Yeah. Let me see. I think the easiest one for me to describe was using components with known vulnerabilities. That's why I put it as the first one, because I was thinking if I had to explain this to someone who has never done anything with security before and they have this resistance to the idea of security, I can present it in a very simple way as, hey, there's this thing that's known to have some stuff in it that's not really good, but you want to use that anyway? Don't do that. I mean, again, that's a very non-technical description of that. So that was a pretty easy one to start off with. The hardest was probably the XML external entities, because that was definitely one where I had to sit down with a bunch of Post-it notes, because that's how I personally like to develop training materials. And I had to map out the kind of diagram of everything that was included in there. Like even trying to, well, you have to explain what XML is. You have to explain what an entity is. Then you get into the concept of a parser too. And as I mentioned, I always want to be very cognizant of not giving students too much of a heavy cognitive load so that they're piecing together so many different parts. But yeah, that one, that it was a challenge, but hopefully it'll help learners to get even just a little bit further into it than they might be.
Fantastic. Thanks, Olivia. I'm actually seeing another question, and this is coming from OWASP's Executive Director, Andrew Vanderstock, which is amazing. He's joining us and watching us live. And he's asking, do you want to work with us, the OWASP Top 10 project, on bringing this up to date when we work on the new OWASP Top 10 2021?
Yes, 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 very much so. Yeah, Andrew, thank you so much for being here. I'm glad you're able to tune in. You know, as I mentioned, this kind of started as like a quarantine project for me, and I happened to tweet about it one day last summer, thinking no one would see it. And then the OWASP DevSlop team saw it, and they're like, "Hey, this sounds great." And I thought, "Oh, now I have to do this." But yay, I get to do this, and I'm so excited because this over the past year has become something that I've realized is not just like a one and done kind of thing. It's definitely something I want to continue to evolve and shape and grow, because I'm just so passionate about helping beginners feel like they have a place in this community. And yeah, so looking forward to continuing to work with everyone.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Olivia. I think we have a question/suggestion. This workbook looks like a fabulous resource. Thank you for creating one. And one suggestion for it is to put a version number or a date on it. So when someone returns, they can easily see if it has been further improved. So currently, if you just open that Google document, you don't really see any version or date.
Agreed. Thank you so much. That has been on my to-do list to add in there. And yeah, definitely want to make sure that people have that reference point there so that they can see. There's also been people who've reached out to me for, they've offered to translate it into so far Spanish and Portuguese. So having that versioning, I think, is going to be really helpful so that we'll keep track of which one is which. And yeah, now that's motivating me to relearn some Spanish. So yeah.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you very much, Olivia. And if you have any further questions, please do ask them on YouTube or on Slido. I hope Olivia will stick with us for the next talk, and we'll be happy to answer further questions. Now I think it's time for us to move on to the next talk, which is Finding Your Next Bug, GraphQL Hacking by Katie Paxton-Fear. So Katie is a lecturer in cybersecurity at Manchester Metropolitan University. However, in her free time, she's quite a famous bug bounty hunter and an educational YouTuber. Katie started hacking in June 2019 during a HackerOne mentorship program, and she's been mentoring others since then, creating educational cybersecurity videos on YouTube. In her videos, she attempts to bridge the gap between I know what bug bounties are and I'm a bug bounty hunter, giving advice specifically tailored to bug hunting and both the beginners and the people who already started their journey into discovering vulnerabilities. Katie has now produced over 50 videos on her YouTube channels on bug bounty hunting for an audience of over 25,000 YouTube subscribers. So aimed at beginner audience usually, but these videos go from finding your first bug, how to use specific tools, and how to find specific bug classes. So another interesting thing to mention that Katie has discovered and responsibly reported security vulnerabilities in several large organizations, such as Verizon Media and even the US Department of Defense. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen, Katie, and you can start sharing yours. Welcome to OWASP London.
Thank you. Oh, it's 1 second.
Okay, we're just waiting for Katie to rejoin. Just quick technical issues. I think Katie is now rejoining Zoom, so she could share her screen. Hello, Katie. We can see you now. Let me make you co-host, so you should be able to share your screen with us right now.
Good. I love computers. They're amazing.
Yes. Things that happen at unexpected time. There you go. I'm gonna try sharing your screen and see if it works now.
Okay.
Yes,
we
can see your screen. Excellent.
Great. Hello, everyone. I'm going to be talking to you today about GraphQL hacking. So if you don't already know, GraphQL is this new in quite a lot of ways. It's definitely being launched in more organizations, way of writing APIs. And it's kind of scary. When you look at it and you go, what? How does this work? This is really confusing, especially if you're like me and are very much used to, RESTful APIs. GraphQL looks very confusing. But actually, because it's so new and because a lot of people misunderstand it, it's actually full of security vulnerabilities. Not on purpose, of course, just by accident. But I'm going to show you how to exploit them and make developers very upset today. So in case you don't know who I am, I know I already got an introduction, but every speaker has one of these slides that show, you know, you should listen to me. I promise I know what I'm talking about. So here's my version. This is me. These are 2 photos of me. If you know me from the internet, you likely know the purple background, but there's also a real life photo of me as well. So my name is Katie Paxton-Fear. I got into hacking in June 2019. I was very fortunate to be invited to a HackerOne live event in London. Now, I originally was like, no, I don't want to. I lived in Swindon. That's like 2 hours on the train, 1 hour on the train. No, thank you. Central London, in the middle of the week on like 9 o'clock, that'll be like hell. But I eventually got pressured into it. And when I was there, I had never done any application security. I can't tell you how unqualified I was. I had never seen BERT. I'd never heard of OWASP. Like, just don't even ask what OWASP was back then. I didn't even, like, I knew what bug bounty hunting was, because I have some friends over in university who are bug bounty hunters, but me, like, I did not know anything about security, and I wouldn't have called myself a security anything at that point. Like, I have a bachelor's in computer science. I worked as a data scientist for about 6 months before I realized I hated my job. And I was a PhD student, and that's how I kind of got into cybersecurity via my PhD, but I still would not have described myself as into security. So that was in June 2019. While I was there, despite never doing any of this stuff in the past at all, I actually found my first vulnerability, and I found my first vulnerability in Uber. I was then very fortunate enough to get invited again to go to Vegas during DEF CON, and I totally thought it was a fluke. I was like, there's no way. There is no way I'm going to find another security vulnerability. That's just silly. And then I found 2 more, and I'm a data scientist. I can see a trend emerging, and that trend to me said, you might be kind of good at this, and this might be something you're good at. So what I really then kind of made it my mission to do is kind of explain things in the way I would have liked them explained to me 6 months prior. So I made a YouTube channel, because that is generation. People a little bit older than me go for blog posts. I go for YouTube. And I've been very fortunate. My YouTube channel has really grown in the past year. Like, I have 25,000 subscribers, which is just so wild to me. I never expected to have that many subscribers at all. And I know some of my subscribers are here. So thank you very much for coming along to my talks. I really do appreciate it. But yeah, so that's where I started. And now, like, we're looking at whatever time is 2021 now, and I've got, you know, over 30 vulnerabilities. All my bugs have been paid out. Like, I've got bounties for all of my vulnerabilities, no NAs, no dupes, like pretty much like on the ball with hacking. And I learned it all myself. Like, I was all self-taught, and what I try to do in my videos is pass that knowledge on. So this is what I'm going to do. So let me talk about GraphQL for a bit. So at the live hacking event in Vegas, I had literally done a CTF at the HackerOne, had done for GraphQL a week before, might have been 2 weeks before. And we're at that event in Vegas. I actually found a GraphQL API, and I was like, well, this is convenient. So I researched over the live hacking event, you know, how GraphQL works. And we submitted like 3 vulnerabilities for GraphQL. And they were valid, and I got paid them out. And despite not really knowing anything about GraphQL, so this is that kind of late night panicked research combined into a presentation. So I've talked a lot about GraphQL, but haven't really explained what it is very well. So GraphQL is an API, but not quite as we know it. Usually when developers write an API, they actually write a lot of different endpoints to do different things. So we think of like CRUD functionality, create, read, update, delete, and each one of those usually has a separate endpoint to it. And then for each resource, you then have to have a CRUD for each thing. So you look at a forum, you've got users, posts, replies, maybe if you've got like some kind of upvote functionality, maybe you have a file upload, and you can quite easily see how an API kind of explodes in terms of size. And that means for a hacker, that means it's exploding an attack surface, which is hard. Like, that's hard to manage and hard to deal with. But GraphQL is like a different way of looking at this. So instead of having this one endpoint for every single resource and then every single like CRUD operation we can do on it, instead we just create one endpoint. And that's it. That's the whole thing. You create one endpoint. Your attack surface is then just one endpoint that you need to secure. And then you write kind of queries, and then you write mutations. So why one endpoint? Well, on the dev side, it makes things quicker. And one thing that's kind of talked about a lot in development circles is how to release code faster. Not because developers have got like, you know, a need for speed, but because development cycles we want them to be quite short, so features get released very quickly. So instead of making endpoints for like every single resource they have, instead they can write a few queries for these common operations. They then use these queries in lots of different places. So you have a lot of reusable code, and developers love reusable code. Now, when we say query, you might be thinking of like SQL queries. And it's kind of similar in the same way that, you know, we have the fields we want, and we have, you know, maybe we have like a check, like a where clause, but it's very different in style, and that's what scares people. But I hope from this presentation you will go, actually, that's not that scary. That's quite straightforward. So why talk about GraphQL? Why hack GraphQL? It's a newer technology. Developers are adopting it without being fully aware of the security concerns that implementing this can cause, which is not great for these users. But I'll be honest, I'm not a user most of the time. I am a bug bounty hunter. And when I see new technologies, I think full of vulnerabilities. And it's intimidating. And that's why also a lot of bug hunters don't really like interacting with GraphQL. They think that it's a bit more stressful, a bit more difficult. But actually, it's not that much harder than API hacking in general. It just looks different. And you also get to do less work as well because of the way GraphQL works, which is really cool, especially in the recon stage. So it's super intimidating, but you don't have to worry. So I hope now I've convinced you that GraphQL hacking is something you should try for yourself. So you're probably thinking, okay, I'm into this, Katie, let's go. Where do I find GraphQL? And you will find GraphQL in the same place you find regular APIs. Tends to be more common with newer applications, especially when they've got kind of potentially more established dev teams. Obviously, it's used at Facebook. They're the people who invented it. But also we have Yahoo uses it quite a lot. Shopify uses it. HackerOne uses it. And these all have bug bounty programs, by the way, as does Facebook, that you can kind of hack on like right now. So GraphQL is usually located at specific endpoints. So you might see GQL, you might see GraphQL, you might find what's called graphical. So that's graph, IQL, pronounced graphical, GraphQL/console. But any kind of request or response, when you start seeing the word mutation, especially mutation, is a great sign that you've got a GraphQL API. But that's a lot about kind of the stuff around it. Let's talk technical. How does GraphQL works? Okay, so GraphQL implements a graph structure as the database. There are queries and mutations. Queries fetch data. Mutations allow data to be edited. Fragments allow for easily saved lists of fields, and meta fields allow for the introspection of query or mutation information. Don't worry if you don't get that. We are going to go into each one. So let's first talk about graph structure. Now, usually, especially if you've been in data and you've designed databases before, you often represent data as tables and of columns and rows, like spreadsheets, right? But actually, when we start to look at APIs, and especially when we start to look at more complex web applications, we actually see linking together. So we start to kind of see those one-to-many, one-to-one, many-to-many connections between different pieces of data. Now, we can think about it in the traditional flat way of like, okay, we're going to do get every book where the author is equal to this author, and we can get the ID and we can do all of this stuff. But actually the natural form of this data is a graph, right? Like if you look at this graph over here, and I show this to you, I'm just trying to laser pointer, you can see we've got books connected to authors, authors connected to authors via co-authors, and we can have different books. And we can see from here, this author has 2 books. And this author has also published with this person here. And you can see how a graph tends to be this kind of natural form of how we might think about this linked data. So queries. Now, queries in GraphQL are written to be flexible. They are very, very flexible. And what happens on kind of the developer side is that you write the queries as a developer. But don't worry, I'm actually going to show you this. You can request any field easily, including related entities on the graph, and then fields associated with that entity. So they're written as kind of like functions. The same way you might write like a PHP function, you can write GraphQL. You can return a single result or several. You can also include arguments or kind of data manipulation. They're very structured. So let's see this in practice. So if I go to my vulnerable API, 127.0.0, there we go. Okay. So what I'm going to turn on is we can see I've got a GraphQL endpoint. So don't worry too much. I'll show you the actual process of hacking this. I'm just going to show you how it works to query it. So if I just cancel that, you can see here I've got this weird console. So all you need to do to write a query is do query. And then you write the query you want. So if we go over here, we can actually see we've got documentation. So we can do, okay, I want to query users. So then we do little curly brackets again. So then you might be thinking, okay, what do you want to return from that? So we can do name. We can do email. We can do whatever fields are in here, we can do. Now, if we press go here, you can see we get the results. So that's how GraphQL queries look. They're very structured, but we can also then explore related fields. So users might have something like grades. So we can go in here and go grades and open this up. And now we can make a query link back to grades. So if I want to do, say, grade here, and then let's get the comments, we can now see that we can query of each user all of their grades, if that kind of makes sense. So what we see here is this quite structured kind of formal way of doing things, but actually it's quite straightforward. It really just takes some time. And this is all well and good when you have the documentation, but you might not always have the documentation, especially if you're hacking. And you can see here, you can also have, in this example, you can do a search. So get the human with the ID of 1000 and get their name and height. You can see here we can have comments, and we can also have related fields that I showed you before. And you can also have other kind of functions like changing the unit. So that's queries. So what about mutations? Now, mutation, especially the word mutation, is very, very obviously GraphQL. And especially if you ever see that in like anything really, and you see, oh, mutation, you should instantly be thinking GraphQL because it's rarely used anywhere else. So while queries fetch data, mutations edit it. So we can look at kind of assign variables, but we can also just do it normally. So if I go back to my little vulnerable API here, so these are my queries. I can go here and go to mutation like this. And then if we go back to the schema, go to mutation, we can see we've got update user password. So let's use that one. Update user password. So we need the ID of the user. So let's do ID 1. And then we need the new password. So let's go hello. Oh, I forgot to label them. ID, and this one is password. Okay, there we go. So now we can return data back from it. So let's get the name, let's get the password, and let's get the ID. So this is our very basic mutation. So if we run that, you can see we can update the user password. Great, awesome. We have like the ID, the name, and the password. Great. So it's not as scary as it first seems. And we can do this. We can also do the same thing where we start to recall related content as well. So that is a very basic mutation. Let's talk about fragments and meta-queries. Now, you don't necessarily have to know these, but it explains how GraphQL works under the hood. So fragments allow you to decide list of fields and request multiple queries using the same list. So you can kind of imagine, oh yeah, I want to get used, like I want every single user to come back with the name and the ID, but I only want those where the ID is less than 5 or where they're not an admin or whatever. So then you can do these kind of fragments. You can see here. You can run this fragment on this comparison here. So it's used for comparisons. It's also used if you want to just return a known list of fields. Now, meta fields allow you to inspect the API. So instead of looking and querying the API, we're querying parts of what the API can do. And that's kind of confusing. And it's really important for something called introspection, which is unique to GraphQL. But I'm going to leave that for the moment because I want to probably answer some of your questions. Okay, but how? How are you supposed to know what queries we have to have, what mutations we have, what arguments there are, what fields you can return? Katie, it's all well and good that you have this API that you have the actual documentation for because you wrote it this week. You can't tell me that if I'm looking at a target, they're going to go, oh yeah, here's our GraphQL API. Have fun. So I'm glad you asked. Let's talk about those fragments and let's talk about those meta queries. So introspection. Introspection is unique to GraphQL. And you might kind of guess by the name, but introspection means to look at the GraphQL API itself and to know something about it. So AKA how to find all those queries and mutations. Just let the API tell you what they are. So why is it important to learn GraphQL syntax? GraphQL is not only challenging because of its syntax, not because it has really hard bugs. Now, the actual bugs in GraphQL are not different than any other bugs you find in any other API. If you look at the OWASP API top 10, it is exactly the same bugs, exactly the same vulnerabilities. I promise you, there is nothing special about GraphQL bugs apart from the syntax. So it's really important to understand how queries and mutations are written and what concepts like meta queries and fragments are. And that's why, because GraphQL is really easy to do recon on. And if you don't like me, don't really like doing recon, you don't have to do it. So let's talk about introspection. Here's introspection query. I'm sure you all understand this and I don't have to go over it more. So introspection is a feature of GraphQL. So because you can have fragments and because you can have meta queries, GraphQL can tell us about its queries. It makes recon a breeze, but we need to interpret the results. So how do we do that? Well, we take this big long thing here. So what this does is return things like the schema. And you can see here we have like schema, query name, name, mutation type, name, types, kind, name, description, fields, include depth, whatever. So what we do is we run this thing and then we put it in a tool called GraphQL Voyager. Now this can help us visualize the output of GraphQL. So let's do it. So actually, if I just end the show, because it'll be a bit easier. Okay, right. So this is our kind of vulnerable API, but we won't normally see graphical. Graphical is quite rare to be to have on like the like just exposed. It tends to be more for kind of testing. But this is the GraphQL kind of endpoint. So I said it only has one endpoint, and it is usually GraphQL query. So I'm going to go here to payload all the things because nothing is ever unique. I'm going to take this entire URL encoded thing for us, and then I'm going to press go. And it's going to return a bunch of garbage. Now, I'm not a computer. I can't naturally read JSON, so I'm not going to. I'm going to take this, copy it, and I'm going to put it into GraphQL Voyager. So if I go over to here, change the schema, introspection, you can just put in the results of the introspection query in there, press display, and it shows you what it looks like. Like you don't have to do anything. It's just here. Right, so what can we see from this? Well, before we could see the the documentation via the schema, via the tool, but we don't have access to that at the moment. So what we can see is we've got queries. So the queries we have are users, grades, vulnerabilities, class, and roles. Maybe it's a little bit larger. So from there, we can see, okay, users, we have a lot of connections. And this is kind of the difficult part of interpreting this. So we can go, okay, query users, right. So what else have we got here? Well, users can get the user's role, we've got the grades, we've got the classes they're in, and the classes they're teaching. So it looks really confusing like this, but actually all we really care about is what's on this side here in the fields. And we can start to craft our queries like this. So we can go, okay, user exists. So we could go in here and we could change this, and we could start to literally go in here and start writing a query that would work. And we can scroll down because we can also access grades, and we can see here we've got access to the user and the uni class. So this is how you would see queries. We can also see mutations, and you can see here that actually, you know, we have these two mutations, user mutation, update user password, and we can see kind of what types it needs, what we need to put in there. You know, we can see that ID is an integer, but name is a string. We can see that we have connections to things like roles, and then we can start to query that and start to better understand the entire API. And what does this really do for us? Well, this allows us to be informed as we test. So we're not just shooting blindly in the dark. We're actually understanding what we're actually looking at and crafting queries. Now, this is important because, like I said, there is no unique vulnerabilities on GraphQL. Now, a lot of people will say that introspection is a vulnerability. It's not a vulnerability. It's a feature of the language. You will probably, if you try and report that, people will just say not applicable or informative at best. Now, being able to go into the introspection and actually understand it, that's where you start to get your vulnerabilities. Because if you know, by looking at this, you know, okay, we can update user password exists. Is there any authentication on that? Can we update anybody's password? You know, we've also got over here in our queries, we have something called vulnerability. Is that secure? Can we just get all the vulnerabilities of the API? That sounds pretty good. So we're not necessarily like limited in this way. So I just put the slides back up. I can kind of show you how this would work on this API as well. So we have this kind of big one, the Star Wars API. I would like to change the pointer to be a laser pointer. Thank you. We can see these connections. So root, we can query for films. And over here, we can see everything a film has. We can then look and see, oh, here's all the types they need. You know, we need, if we want to get the film, we need the ID and we need the film ID. If we want to get all the people, we need the person ID. We can then look and see these like more in-depth look at this kind of API where we have the release date, which we know is a string, but we know it's formatted in ISO, right? So now we can start to build these queries and we can start to better understand the API. So you might also have, you know, mutations, and, you know, I showed you a very, very small API, but these can have hundreds of mutations. They can have a lot of them, and we need to test each one of these for vulnerabilities. So what next? Well, what next is that we know on all the endpoints, we can actually skip right to the API hacking. We know the endpoints because we know they're the queries and mutations. We can just find normal API bugs. It's not different. It's just a different like visual, right? So I do want to say this again because I think it's quite important. I think people get confused. Introspection itself is not considered a vulnerability in most applications. It's considered documentation. Now, what we'd want to do is we want to test all these queries just like we test a regular API. There is no difference. But sometimes introspection is disabled because people do see it as a security risk. They may not pay it out as a vulnerability, but they might see it internally as well. We can still find, use recon to find API endpoints. We can click buttons. We can figure out the structure of queries. We can replace likely entity names or just test visible GraphQL endpoints. Keep an eye out for any documentation, like Shopify has extensive documentation. Errors. GraphQL will handily tell you what you messed up so you can go ahead and fix it. Thanks, GraphQL. That was really helpful. I didn't know how I was supposed to do that, but now you've told me. Okay, so tools. Now, there are some tools which are unique to GraphQL, so I just wanted to kind of go over some of them. So first is GraphQL IDE. So this makes it a little bit easier to interact with a GraphQL API by just being in a IDE. Fairly easy to use. You're still going to be writing your queries by hand when you get to the exploitation stage, but it's a great way of kind of visualizing it as an alternative to graphical. Altair, which is very similar, looks a lot like Postman. So if you used Postman before, you probably kind of familiar. It also is dark. So if you also don't like bright lights, you can use that one as well. You're still going to be handwriting your queries. You're always going to be handwriting your queries, unless you use some of these ones. So I'm going to show you how to use this when we get to the demonstration. But we have something called InQL, which is a burp add-on, which sends an introspection query to show the queries and mutations. It integrates with burp directly. So if you didn't know, book bounty hunters don't like using OWASP. We much prefer burp. I'm really sorry. I'm very, very sorry. I'm going to be using burp, but it integrates quite well. And if you're already a power user of burp and you already have a lot of tools via burp, this can be a really great way of just getting it in there. And it can also generate documentation. It's really cool. It will also run a graphical instance locally. So you can actually still have access to graphical. So you can use it like that. We also have GraphQL map. So if you're familiar with SQL map, you might know it can do things like do SQL injection automatically and do a bunch of different ways of doing it. But GraphQL map is very similar. Works in the command line. It doesn't just do introspection though, it can also generate NoSQL and SQL injection payloads as well. GraphQL path enum, understand large graphs. What you may have noticed from all of this is that GraphQL can get very complex very, very quickly, especially when you have like loads of different entities, you have loads of different queries and you don't know how they're all related. This is a really great tool which will show you how to get from node A to node B using queries. So it's really useful when you're testing something. You're going to go, oh, I have access to users. How do I get to, I don't know, grades from that? And it kind of walks through it to show it. So you can kind of see it here. So it will go the query assignable teams to team audit log items to audit log items to user, etc. So it's quite nice. Okay, so GraphQL bugs in the wild. What bugs should you be looking for? They are the same as API bugs. I keep saying this, but I think it's really important to say that the API bugs you find in GraphQL are the same as you find in regular APIs. You get the usual suspects, information disclosure, IDORs, bypassing client restrictions. The only thing that makes it special is the syntax, and that is the only thing that you should be worried about. Okay, so I will show you some examples. So this was an undocumented API, GraphQL API endpoint, just allowed you to change a store's customer email. It was one like mutation on the GraphQL endpoint. Didn't have proper authentication on it. Very simple. Got paid out $1,500 for it. Like, these are not really complex bugs. This is an interesting one. This is an information disclosure which shows the internal beer consumption at Shopify. Sorry. So they basically enumerated the GraphQL API. They use introspection, realized it has references to beer. So then they started to send these crafted queries to find out what they could discover. And they realized this is the internal like ale tap, which apparently also uses GraphQL to see how full all of the barrels are. So then they said, this should really be internal, I guess. And that got paid out like $800. I think it was more for fun, more than actual information disclosure. But, that's really simple. It was just query the API. There was nothing special about it. And here's a more serious example of the same thing. By querying the GraphQL API directly, it was possible for a user to have some information about internal activity on HackerOne reports. That's it. That's the whole vulnerability. It is using the GraphQL API to send a crafted query And that's it. That's the whole bug. It is one, like you can see here, it is one request. These are not really complex bugs. And are there GraphQL specific bugs? Yes, there are. And that's mainly because of the way GraphQL is built. There are some unique ones, and it primarily revolves around how the queries have been written in the code and implemented. But these usually require access to the source code and like skills and source code review. So I'm not really going to go over them too much, but there are bugs that can appear just in GraphQL. But I don't really make videos for people who already know what they're doing. My videos are introductory videos. So we start at the basics, and the basics are exactly the same. There is nothing special about GraphQL APIs. Let's hack some stuff. So how do we actually hack a GraphQL API? How do we actually do this from start to finish? So your general approach when approaching a GraphQL API should be first to use introspection to find the queries and mutations. Now, if you can't find them or it doesn't work, don't worry, just press all the buttons instead. That is my traditional recon approach. If somebody asks me how I do recon, I just press all the buttons. Like literally, if you're on an app, for example, you go into the hamburger menu, you change like every random thing you can find, just collect API endpoints as much as you can. And what you then want to do is identify the business logic revolving around those queries. And you can craft your queries to check for what I think are the two biggest but easiest to find issues, which is first information disclosure, and secondly IDORs, so insecure direct object reference, or they are also called BOLAs, so broken object level authorization. And you can also find broken function level authorization. We call them IDORs in the bug bounty community. Now, remember, and I keep on saying this because I think it's really important, the hard part of GraphQL is the syntax. Once you get over the syntax, you can really show or kind of understand how it works. But, you know, don't just tell me this. That's really boring to listen to. Let's do it together. So I showed you this kind of setup before. What I'm going to do is now show you it in Burp itself. So I've got Burp open here, and you can kind of see. And I'm using the free version. You don't need to pay for Burp when you first get started. I'm going to go into the proxy, and I'm going to turn Incept off because Incept is annoying. So I've opened up our little port swigger thing here. And what I'm going to do is just copy this and put it into there. And we should be able to now see in Burp, we can see the GraphQL endpoint. Great. So we can use InQL. So it has a scanner here, and it can automatically find all of the mutations and all of the queries like this. And as you can see, I didn't even press any buttons. It just did it automatically. Now, the cool thing is if I open this thing, you can open... Go in here. Open in browser. Okay, wrong screen. Right. So you can see in here, it actually has generated some documentation for us, just like GraphQL Voyager. But I'm going to show you using GraphQL Voyager. So initially, what we see here is we can see all of the little endpoints here have been disclosed, and we can see if we click on grades here. We can see we've got like some information about the grades. We can see we've got like all of the variables associated with it and all the columns. And then you can see we've able to access users and then roles and then classes. So what we can do here is we can go center repeater, and we can, there we go. Now we can see and change this. So the first thing we want to do is we might want to see, okay, grades. We've got comments created at, updated at, grade ID. So the first thing you might want to do there is that's obviously doing some kind of filtering. Let's remove that. So what is actually in here? So we can see grades here. So you can see this first one is a grade of 33 for user nothing. So let's find out what the user is. So you can go in here, And we can send that. And now we can see the name of the person. So we can see the user with the name hello has gotten quite a few of these grades. But then when we scroll down, we can see, oh, we're starting to get real data here. So we can scroll down here and we can do this backwards as well. So we've got some kind of class is null. So we might want to do, instead of description, use name. I think it's called uniclass. Is it uniclass? Maybe it is just class. So we can see something's up with class, but I mean, do we really need to tell? If we can see other people's grades regardless, and we can get their name, we've probably got a vulnerability here, but we can do more than that because you can see roles here. What we might want to do is just see what all the roles are. So we'll go here, we'll remove grades and change that to roles. And then we'll open it up and let's try and see if we can see any interesting roles. We might want to have the ID in there as well. So we can see here, we can see admin, student, teacher. So that's useful. How do we know which users are in each of those? Well, you can just access it via the API. We can go into user here and then we can ask for their name, their email. You can try password as well, see if that works. So we can see here, we can't see the users associated with it. So what we might want to then do is go and see why that's the case. So looking in here, going into what the other queries are and seeing, well, we don't really have, we have a users query and they seem to have some kind of access to role this way. So we can go backwards as well. But that's probably not the most interesting one because we've got an update user password and an update user. So let's assume we're doing an attack. Let's have a look at all the users and try and find which ones have a role ID of admin. So if we go here, we probably want let's take all of that stuff. Let's get rid of that, get rid of created at. We don't want role created at. We would like the name potentially. We'll go in here, go here, go here, send it. And you can see here, okay, role student. If we scroll here, though, we can see the admin user is Dolores Green that has the email cgrady@hotmail.com. Now, why is this kind of useful for us? Well, I don't know if you saw, but one of the mutations is update user password. So if we go here and we go, you know, send to repeater, and we kind of make it look nice again, we can see, you know, we need the new password and then the ID. Well, the ID of this user is 6, so we'll put in 6 for the ID, and we'll keep the password as code. So we're updating the user with ID 6 with the password code. So we'll press send, and it says success. Great. Now if we go here, we go to our vulnerable API here. Go back to the whole application, log in, that email address, code, log in, and as you can see, we've logged into the admin user. And that is how easy it is to get started with GraphQL. Like, again, not a very complex vulnerability, simple because this API endpoint didn't have any authorization on it. Very straightforward. There's nothing special we did. We literally just changed an ID to 6. It was understanding, which is the hard part, and that's syntax. So with that, that is the end of my presentation this evening on GraphQL hacking. I hope you found it useful, interesting, entertaining. Yeah, thank you very much for listening to me waffle about APIs.
Fantastic. Thanks very much, Katie, for an amazing live demo and your talk. I'm checking for questions. There are a couple of them coming up on Slido and on YouTube. Question number 1, someone is asking, what is payload all the things and where is it?
So payload all the things is a great Git repository, which has a bunch of payloads for security people. So you can see here, we've got like a bunch of GraphQL and how to do like, down here we have NoSQL injection and SQL injection, but it has more than just GraphQL. it has a bunch of these different ones. We have everything from file inclusion, directory traversal, JSON web token stuff, cross-site scripting, all of that. Like, I'll put it in the chat in here so people can have a look. But it's a fantastic repository. It is so useful.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Katie. And there's another question. What if introspection is off and I can't find any mutations? Is it still possible to find any vulnerabilities?
Yeah, so people don't make GraphQL endpoints just to have them sit around. They will be somewhere in the web application or the mobile application. You just need to sit there and search for it. Yes, it sucks. Yes, it's very time consuming. But if you just poke around, you can find quite a lot. And I would say for majority of API bugs that you can find quite a lot of them by just pressing every button, especially if you're like me and don't really like the kind of recon side of it. You can just sit there and, you know, press buttons, change your say username, change your password, change your email address. Those might be 3 different mutations. Maybe it's one mutation that's just change user. Then you can see, oh, you know, I can see I can see, oh, not only in this mutation can I change my email address, but I can also change my password. Is that actually secure? Has that actually got authorization on it? There's a methodology there, and it's not just chaos, but it is very close to chaos.
Excellent, thanks. We have another question coming up on YouTube. Are there any GraphQL extensions for OWASP Zap?
I have no idea because I don't use OWASP Zap, but there is no reason why you can't like use just a graphical in the browser. You can actually host graphical locally because that's what this thing does. Where is the thing? There is a thing, you can see it. This can actually load up graphical automatically. There we go. So InQL can load GraphQL graphically on even a remote GraphQL API. So you can actually set up graphical to have it as your like little tool. You don't really need complex tools. You really don't. It is very much a case of write a query, URL encode it, send it, see what happens.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. There's another question coming up. Katie, while hacking GraphQL, what was the most difficult hack?
I won't answer that question. I'll tell a better story instead. Sounds a bit weird, but I promise. So when I was actually hacking GraphQL at the time, I had gone into a hotel room with my mentors, and this was at Vegas. So I had like a formal mentorship program. So I went into the hotel room, we started hacking, and in 5 minutes, I'd found a vulnerability in the GraphQL API. And I didn't find it by doing introspection or anything like that. I found it by just pressing the buttons and changing like values. So I think I changed, I saw what the endpoint was then kind of calling, and you had to do something beforehand, but I was basically able to skip a bunch of steps. And redeem all of my points that I'd then collected for money. And I found that in 5 minutes. I then spent the rest of the day trying to find more vulnerabilities in this API, found a few others, but then never quite got to level exploiting it. So I did a introspection query because 5 minutes I didn't quite know what I was doing. By the time I got to kind of later on in the day, I knew what introspection was. Did that, pasted it in. It was maybe 10 minutes till the end. Very much cutting it close, and this massive API popped up, and I was like, oh, I do not have time to look at all of these endpoints. Oh. And then from that I was like, okay, well, and then got some pretty okay vulnerability. I think it wasn't great, but it was fine. But they paid out money, so yeah, that was very stressful though. Once again, leaving it till the very end of the event to find my bugs.
Excellent. Thank you, Katie. I think there's a question about what's the name of your YouTube channel. I believe it's Inside the PhD. Is that right?
Yes, I'm also in the chat as well. I've got like a purple avatar, but yeah, Inside a PhD is my YouTube channel. I'm very proud to say you can now Google me, which is one of my best achievements in my life. Yes, there's not much else happening in my life, but being able to be Googled, yeah, if you Google me, you'll also find my YouTube channel as well. And it's also Inside a PhD. PhD is the academic qualification, insider as an insider threat, not inside a PhD, and not PHP, the programming language, though I do mainly use that, and that's what this demo was built in.
Oh, yes. And of course, congratulations on completing your PhD thesis. It's all about using machine language. So the machine learning. Yes, there it is. For inside the threats, right? So this is
yeah, all about, yeah, my background is NLP. So this is all about how you can look at loads of reports and understand an incident.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure a lot of people who have to analyze lots of text and chats and figure out if there's any insider threat, their organizations are gonna really be appreciating your PhD thesis. Right, let's check if there are any more questions. Are there any questions from our other speakers or co-presenters? Let me just check. I'm not seeing any new questions. So there's one which is probably a very generic one. I'm pretty sure people probably ask you this quite frequently. Someone is asking, do I need to know both network and web concepts to become a good security analyst?
Oh, that's a really good question. I personally think it's good to understand how the internet works, because what you'll find, and this is my experience, is that you'll learn about how the internet works and you'll go, this shouldn't be possible. The internet might be cursed, because the way the internet works is actually kind of mind-blowing that we have so many things that actually work for the internet. Like, how on earth does YouTube work when you start looking at like networking protocols? It's incredible. So I would say do that to just appreciate more how the internet works. But I really don't think you need to be an expert in web application security. I think what makes a good security analyst is a mixture of not just being like the amazing, extra smart, huge brain security person, but communication skills is one of the most vital skills in security, because you are always going to spend your entire career telling people that something they're looking at is a security risk, and being able to speak to them in their own language is a really big help in that.
Excellent. Thanks, Katie. I believe, Olivia, do you have a question for Katie?
No, I just want to add on. I'm like over here just kind of silently clapping with the part about communication being so important, and it's exactly why I want to make sure that beginners have that, because it's one thing to read something and think you understand it, but then especially when you think about how to communicate with people in different audiences, you have to know how to be able to switch things up and go more or less technical depending. So I completely agree.
Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks. And I think my colleague Sharif has a question for you. Sharif, go ahead.
Hey, Katie. How are you?
Hey, I'm good.
So, it's good to see you again. So my question was with regards to the OWASP Foundation. So this was a really amazing demo. Would you like to have a small article and put that video on one of the OWASP blog posts?
Oh yeah, for
so
sure.
Folks can see quickly on the OWASP website. Great. And to be cheeky, second question is, so what can we do with Zaps that you guys would like it?
Oh, okay. I'm glad you asked. Bam, because I brought some homework with me. So this is the code that powers it. So what makes something vulnerable to some of these vulnerabilities and what makes them not vulnerable? Let me show you. So if we go into vulnerability query, you'll see there's this one line here that says, if the user isn't logged in, don't let them access it. So my top advice would be maybe put an if statement in when you're authorizing things, because one line will save you like tons of vulnerabilities. It's amazing how many vulnerabilities are literally caused by an if statement being missing. And in this case as well, this demo is built on Laravel. Laravel has middleware, and you can put middleware into your code, so that way you only have to write like one if statement and then you just tell it what middleware to use. Excellent. This This one line here, this is what I'd recommend. And I'm being kind of facetious here, but actually quite a lot of security vulnerabilities are caused by very simple, like just mistakes in code. And it happens. Applications are huge, they're big, they are very complex, and stuff like this just gets missed. So having good code review practices, making sure that developers are peer reviewing themselves, having an open security culture where people can say, hey, I think there's a mistake, I think there's a security vulnerability here, that isn't going to then have this kind of knock-on effect of like shaming developers for not being good enough, or creating kind of negative aspects in the security culture. And I think also having like security culture in general, you know, if you can support it, having a bug bounty program, potentially, if you can't support it, maybe looking at just having a security.txt where people can access a security contact if they need to, engaging with the wider security community, and just being open to some of these ideas.
Cool. Thank you, Katie. I was asking about OWASP ZAP though. Like, what things can we change in OWASP ZAP that?
Oh, sorry.
To prefer over burp? Like, how do we get it to a point where bug bounty hunters like it almost as much as burp?
My biggest concern with it is the UI. The UI is much worse. Burp's UI isn't great, but OWASP ZAP is much more confusing. Just needs to be simplified. If the UI was better, I think more people would use it because it has more tools that Burp doesn't have, or that Burp users have to pay for. And I think it's going to be really hard to get us off of the port swigger in general. People like me, and I'm calling myself out, this is a self-roast, need to be promoting open source software instead of promoting paid software, especially when a lot of people who want to get into bug bounty can't necessarily afford software which is over £300. And yeah, people need to realize it's an option, and I'd like it if the UI was much simpler as well.
No, perfect. And that's really nice feedback. We need to know these things so we figure out how we can improve it and get more people to like it and use it. So much appreciated. Thanks.
Yeah, just to add, not many people know, but I believe both Burp and Zap started as forks of another tool called Paros Proxy many years ago.
I didn't know that, actually. That's interesting.
Okay, any more questions? Let me check if we have anything on YouTube. No, I think this is it. So thanks very much, Katie. And this was an amazing talk, and of course, some amazing questions and answers as well. Thanks very much for taking the time to come to OWASP London and present your talk here. I'm pretty sure this is probably not your last talk. We will invite you again and again, and same thing with you, Olivia. Many thanks for joining us. Now I would like to just switch to the couple of reminders that we have. It's a main question that usually we get asked is, how do we find out when is the next event? And this is actually quite a simple task. Let me just share my screen so you can see. Okay, yeah. So if you want to follow us, you can visit our webpage on owasp.org. You can follow us on Twitter at OWASP London. You can like us on Facebook. We have a Facebook page also called OWASP London. We're also on OWASP Slack. OWASP has a Slack called owaspslack.com, and we are on a channel called Chapter-London. We're also on Meetup. OWASP London is our Meetup page. You can watch us on YouTube. You are obviously watching us on YouTube on our channel. Please do subscribe to make sure you don't miss any new videos and video recordings. And we're also on LinkedIn, where we have OWASP London page. I would like to thank our chapter supporters one more time. And before we say goodbye, I would like to ask Sharif if he wants to give us a brief update from the OWASP board. Okay, and I think Sharif has just dropped off, which is let me see if I can reconnect him. No. Looks like it doesn't work, which is fine. Okay, so thank you everyone for joining us. And if you follow us and on Twitter, please make sure You can also ask more questions to our presenters and speakers. I'm pretty sure they will be able to answer them using their Twitter accounts. And thank you very much. I would like to finish tonight's event by saying that all the slides will be shared on OWASP London webpage under past events, and all the recordings will be published on OWASP London YouTube channel. Thank you very much for joining us, and we'll see you next time. Thank you. Bye.